Good afternoon, everybody. Before I begin, I just want to say that I'm honored to be both a guest and now once again, at least periodically living here in the unceded territories, traditional unceded territories of the Lekwungen people. Today, I want to explore the experiences of British Columbians who remained home during the Second World War. When we discuss the war, understandably, we tend to focus on the people who put on a uniform, who enlisted, who went overseas to fight. They sacrificed much. They experienced often terrible things. And many never returned. And those who did were often scarred in body, mind, and spirit. So that attention is not misplaced. More than 90,000 men and women from British Columbia would enlist and serve during the Second World War, from a population of about 792,000 in 1939. So it's about 12% of the population, 2% higher than the national average. But that still leaves 700,000 British Columbians who experienced the war not in uniform. Often the home front experience is spoken of in vague, kind of passive terms, that people experienced the conflict, suffered its effects, were buffeted by the winds of war. It is something that happens to them. And that's true to some extent. But it also suggests that this was a passive process, that British Columbians didn't have agency in their experience of war. And I don't think that actually captures accurately British Columbians' experience of that wartime years. Yes, they had to respond to forces, actions, to hardship that was foisted upon them by global events, national events, and actors. But they didn't just sit in their kitchens for 6 long years and wait for the fighting to end. They actively participated in the war effort. They worked, they volunteered, they gave their money, they participated in patriotic events, they supported their troops abroad, and they kept watch and they defended their own communities here in BC. In essence, I'm suggesting that British Columbians fought the war from home. And considered in that context, I'd argue their war experiences very much deserve our attention too, if we were to understand the war years and modern British Columbia, which arises in the wake of the Second World War. And yet we know shockingly little about BC at war and about its home front. So if you'll humor me for a moment and begin with a small exercise. Sort of close your mind, your eyes for a moment. Think of the Second World War in relationship to your sense of self as a Canadian, to our national story. And I think it conjures up a multitude of images, events, and memories. Not working here. All right, so stepping back into where I was at, thinking about our experience in the Second World War as Canadians, and it conjures a multitude of images. There are events and memories that we as Canadians collectively share. Oh, of course, now. No? There we go. There we go. Okay. I have to kick it old school here. So we had things like Canada's declaration of war, massive recruitment marching off to war, the Battle of the Atlantic against German U-boats, the strategic bombing campaign. The ill-fated operations at Hong Kong and Dieppe, the internment and dispossession of Japanese Canadians, the wartime economic boom, the massive expansion of women's economic and social roles, the Italian campaign, D-Day, and the conscription crisis. And finally, VE Day, and much less importantly for Canadians, VJ Day, followed by demobilization, the baby boom, and the relative prosperity of the post-war years. It's a story I think most Canadians know to varying degrees. Much of it falls within this nostalgic framing of the good war, so ably explored by Tim Cook. Now, pardon the diversion into our national memory, we're here to talk more about British Columbia. But now if you kind of take off your national hat, metaphorically speaking, put on your British Columbian hat, let's see if we could draw up a similar list, shall we? Are there images and memories that come to mind?
Yeah.
It's not so easy though, is it? The list is
Japanese.
the internment of the Japanese. That one does cross over, absolutely. But beyond the Japanese internment, it becomes difficult to point to BC stories of the Second World War that remain part of the broader public memory. People might have heard of the shelling of the Estevan Point Lighthouse by Japanese submarine I-25, or the terrorist conscript mutiny, perhaps.
Don't pay attention.
This absence of memory I find interesting. I think it implies that the war was not a formative part of the province's development, or somehow not a profound experience in the memories of British Columbians who lived through the war. So the war doesn't connect to who and what we are today as British Columbians in that sense. And perhaps it's not surprising under those circumstances that it's also largely absent from the academic history of the province as well. I did an article on this a few years ago. Only a few stories about the war have tended to become part of the broader historical narratives of British Columbia. They obviously include Japanese internment, the provincial politics of Premier Duff Patullo in the early years, the rising Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, for today's NDP, and the coalition government of Tories and Liberals that governed the province quite capably through the bulk of the war. And the third story that sometimes gets mixed into the provincial surveys is the developments in labor organization, particularly in forestry. The largest of the broad survey histories of BC, Jean Barman's The West Beyond the West, it's a huge synthesis of a rich and vibrant collection of historical writing produced on this province's past, 420 pages of text, of which 3 describe the experiences of the Second World War, and 5.5 the treatment of residents of Japanese background. Proportionally, that is shockingly slim, and again implies the Second World War is not really part of the important narratives that British Columbians, that form British Columbia. And yet, in that literature, the Second World War has been tended to be used as a pivot point between the pre-modern colonial, early provincial era of our history as a province and modern British Columbia, which especially comes into focus during the decades-long tenure of W.A.C. Bennett and his Social Credit Party after 1952. And for me, that's a bit of a problem. It is this strange blank space in our collective past, which has inspired my current project to explore BC's homefront. And I'm particularly interested in the role played by community in mediating and moderating British Columbians' engagement in the often distant phenomenon of war. Robert Retherdale published a great book, The Great War Homefront, arguing that Canadians essentially experience that distant event from within the confines of their hometown horizons, which I think is a lovely turn of phrase. And thus the distinct contours of each specific community shaped its own distinct experience of war. And I think that's a good model to use for exploring BC's experience during the 1930s and 40s. The province was still very much divided by its complex and challenging geography, the coast from the interior, the north from the south, the islands from the mainland, one mountain valley from the next, only intermittently connected by transportation links. I think it's Barman that suggests that think of it as kind of like an archipelago of settlements, but often very distant from one another. You couldn't even drive from the coast to the Okanagan until the 1930s, and then on gravel roads. And so for many of its residents, any meaningful, broader sense of this province as an imagined entity was weak, or in some cases non-existent. I think a community-centered approach gets us closest to the war experiences of BC residents, whether in Victoria, Ocean Falls, Kelowna, Prince Rupert, or 100 Mile House. And given how little remains of the war in our memory and our history, was the war, in fact, an important event for British Columbia? It raises that question. Now, I'm only partway through the research for this long, multi-year project I'm on. That will take me to several dozen community archives around the province, as well as provincial and federal ones, along with digitizing about 15 or so BC newspapers from different communities. But the work I've completed so far would suggest that the short answer to that question is yes, the war was important. In fact, hugely important in the lives of British Columbians. And it fundamentally transformed the development of the province economically, logistically, and demographically. Now, we can't get through all of that today. I can delve into a number of these elements, And I'm going to focus on using some of the fantastic images that I'm running across in the archival research that I've been doing. One of the major outputs for this project is going to be a large, well-illustrated sort of coffee table book that will be written for a broader audience. And honestly, I am hugely enjoying the novelty of working with so many images, many of which, like the ones in the poster for this talk, are really incredibly evocative. It's a rarity. In academic book publishing, traditionally you get a dozen, 15, maybe images you could include. And so having the luxury of working now with hundreds, even thousands of photographs thus far has been, I feel like a bit of a kid in the candy store. So I'm going to use my PowerPoint here, use these images to kind of walk us through some of the elements of British Columbians' engagement with and experience of the Second World War. So we'll start with the transformation of the economy and the transportation infrastructure of the province. The war produced an economic boom in BC, as it did across the rest of the country, which was urgently needed in the decade following the decade of economic pain and suffering that was the Great Depression. The major resource extraction industries that were BC's lifeblood in the 1930s and 40s also felt this massive expansion, both to feed Canada's wartime industries, but also there were export markets now to support our allied countries as well. And so mining, fishing, forestry all expanded their production in leaps and bounds. Almost 2.25 million cases of canned salmon were packed in 35 BC canneries in 1941 alone. And of that, 2/3 were shipped to Britain to help feed its population, as well as the many military personnel who were gathered there. In 1942, the entire BC catch was shipped to BC. Sometimes our forest and other industries had direct implications for the war effort, particularly the Sitka spruce from Haida Gwaii, which was used for the airframes of mosquito fighter bombers due to their flexibility, lightweight, and strength. The mosquito bomber was an important and one of the fastest aircraft in the earlier part of the war. The war intruded in other ways as well. We know, of course, of the internment of the Japanese population here in BC, which took a large portion of people out of the Pacific salmon fleet and cannery workforce. Their places were largely filled by Indigenous workers, women in the canneries and men in a lot of the fishing vessels. And after the war, many would remain in those industries in some parts of the coast. Agriculture fits into that story as well. Here, the struggle consistently lasted throughout the war, finding enough labor. Agriculture needed wartime labor to get the crop off in the fall. And that labor was hard to find with so many people in uniform or employed in other areas of industry. And so programs were developed to try and fill the void, in some cases using skilled school children, which was of dubious effectiveness. There were efforts made to recruit urban women here in BC, again, without much success. And ultimately, by 44 and 45, the void was only filled by bringing prairie women, Saskatchewan and Alberta women, to help fill that void and make sure BC apples got picked, amongst other things. Shipbuilding, of course, always part of the story as well. It's a big success, particularly in North Vancouver and Vancouver, though here in Victoria as well. The industry would grow to employ over 24,000 people by 1943. That produced something in the nature of 2/3 of the merchant and warships built in Canada during the war. I particularly love that shot at the left.
Yeah.
That's just wonderful. Anyway. Both in terms of ports and railway systems, our transportation system would be augmented during the war. There was still a lot of latent capacity that was not utilized after the Depression years, but the wartime boom massively expanded the traffic on BC railroads and out of BC ports, with the export markets for coal, wheat, lumber, ore, and other metals, and a host of other products. And so port facilities, both in Vancouver and Prince Rupert, expanded. The latter in particular because it was a primary transshipment point for the Americans supplying and reinforcing Alaska after the entry of Japan into the war. Roads as well. There was some road development during the war, but wartime gasoline rationing, some reduction in tourism, although it didn't go away entirely, and the diversion of resources to the war effort put a hold on a lot of new road development during the war years. Exceptions were the Big Bend highway between Revelstoke and Golden, which was completed in 1940. There was also some development on the Hope Princeton continued at a reduced pace during the war. Despite arguments for the strategic value of a second road route into the interior, there's still only the one up the canyon. But the BC government was slow to pursue this. And so some work was done by interned Japanese men primarily, clearing and way, and there was some fresh surveying done on the route, but the road would be pushed through very quickly in the wake of the war and was opened in 1949. And of course, the other major road route developed during the war was the Alaska Highway, built by US Army engineers from Dawson Creek, north and west across the province. The province's remote north, the southern Yukon on its way to Alaska. This, again, strategically important route. Tens of thousands of US military personnel, as well as civilian contractors, many of them Canadian, essentially invaded what had previously been a quite quiet and sheltered region of the province. Places like the tiny hamlet of Fort St. John exploded into activity as the world landed on their doorstep, seemingly overnight. You can imagine a village of maybe 500 people at the war's outbreak, suddenly having thousands, even tens of thousands of US personnel passing through. What had been a one restaurant town, in no way with the capacity to service all those American personnel, would find itself, the Americans set about building a theater, baseball diamonds, a hockey rink, all of these made available for community use. And even with the post-war slump, the existence of that highway as a main and turned Fort St. John into a transit hub for the future. When the war came to an end, of course, the pent-up demand for expansion of highway systems to connect various isolated regions of the province was enormous. And this became a core part of the province's post-war reestablishment and reconstruction plan, was to build highways across the region, just as vehicle ownership was really starting to expand exponentially, to take advantage of all those new travel opportunities. Port St. John. Airports, another legacy of the Second World War. Significant elements of BC's current air transportation network were established in the midst of the war or augmented. The British Commonwealth Air Training Program was a huge training infrastructure and program set up across the country. There were a number of airfields here along the coast that became important: Victoria and Abbotsford, Boundary Bay, and elsewhere. There's also the Northwest Staging Route, providing aircraft transportation systems to link along the Alaska Highway to Alaska. And a lot of these would linger after the war. These became legacies. Even Gordon Head, where an airport was an offshoot of the Pat Bay system. We don't have an airport there now, but we do have a university campus, which was complete with the wartime huts that accommodated air crew and ground crew. And I think still does have some of those huts, does it not? Yes. I remember them from when I was there. There's also Comox, of course, which had an air base developed there in the middle portions of the war, and which remains a Canadian active air base today. So in a lot of ways, this infrastructure left an important legacy for post-war civilian infrastructure, or air travel in BC, that was still utilized. Demographic shifts. One aspect of the pressures created by the Second World War in BC society was the degree of mobility that it fostered within the populace, both voluntary and coerced. Most evident, of course, is the forced removal of people of Japanese ancestry from the coastal exclusion zone. Many were forced to migrate eastward into camps in the interior, in the valleys of the southern interior. Others were shipped to southern Alberta or as far away as southern Ontario. In some of these communities, those populations began to integrate themselves. Places like Greenwood or the Slocan, where the first Japanese baby was born in Greenwood in 1942. But by the time we get to the end of the war, the Japanese population is now an important element within that community. So too in the Slocan. Though of course, that's not to say everybody made them welcome. And BC's anti-Japanese racism was not only a coastal phenomenon. Interesting welcome signs. Few Japanese people would ever return to the coastal regions that had been their homes before the war broke out. Some remained in the interior, others either stayed or moved east of the Rockies, and thousands were expatriated to Japan, even though many were Canadian citizens who had never been there. Second major demographic phenomenon of wartime was to substantially accelerate two trends that were already evident in the early years of the 20th century in terms of population growth and transition from a rural to an increasingly urban population. People were leaving rural BC for its towns and cities that have been evident through the Great Depression years. It was accelerated in wartime by the opportunities that wartime industries offered for employment. And the war would massively expand the population of British Columbia, drawing people from the prairies and further east as well. When you compensate, and it's more than compensated, sorry, for the more than 90,000 people that served in the armed forces. During the war years, about 163,000 interprovincial migrants settled in BC. So the population that had been 792,000 in 1939 grew by 1946, when the last of the mobilized personnel returned home, to a little over 1 million, roughly 20% in 7 years. That's a huge, huge expansion in population. And of course, that boom resulted in a critical housing shortage. Our present housing shortage is not the first one we've lived through. In Vancouver, things were most severe. There, inadequate, insufficient, and unaffordable housing was already an issue before the Great Depression, which brought new housing construction almost to a screeching halt through the 1930s. And then, of course, the war intervened, and it remained difficult to find the materials, the labor, or the government authorization to build new housing. But the crisis was becoming sufficient by the midpoint of the war that governments were starting to find resources to dedicate to some new housing projects as the war continued. But it would take until the early 1950s, at least in Vancouver, for some of that crisis to ease. In addition to the people who migrated here during the war, of course, thousands, tens of thousands of Canadians from all across the country were posted here at some stage during the Second World War. There were more than 30,000 Army personnel defending the West Coast from a potential Japanese attack in 1942-43, and many thousands more cycled through at some point during the war. Add in thousands of Air Force and naval personnel, and some of them came to appreciate BC's charms while they were here and would return to settle in the post-war years. All of which ensured that the wartime boom in population and expansion of the economy would continue on into the post-war years, entrenching the province's place as the third most populous province in Confederation. Another interesting factor is that with so many men moving into the armed forces in the war, it meant for the first time in the province's history, there were more women in BC aged 15 to 29 than men. The gender balance had been slowly equalizing through the early 20th century, but it still retained a male-heavy balance as a leftover of its colonial era and still quasi-frontier-like economy. And this would make its presence felt across the communities of the province. In school population, the workplace, and social settings, we see increasingly larger numbers of women and fewer numbers of men. The war brought increases in the marriage rates. After the reticence of the Depression years, when many people put off getting married or starting a family because of the economic hardship, well, now the prospect of good paying jobs meant it was possible to get married. And you see thousands of wedding pictures like this with men in uniform. There was a rise in fertility rates as well, but with men leaving for the war, much of this also gets put off, which is why, of course, the return at the end of the war and the baby boom that followed was people making up for lost time. In a more diverse way, though, the war reached into people's lives across the broad spectrum of their experience. And I just want to traipse through the varied ways in which the war began to insinuate itself into British Columbians' world and let the images try and do some of the storytelling here. But before I go into this too much, I also want to highlight the degree of continuity that many British Columbians experienced during the war years. Well, I'm very interested in where the war was felt and where it wrought change. But we need to keep in mind that people continued to do many of the same things they did in their lives in Canada before war broke out in September 1939. They went to church, kids went to school, people worked, they gathered, they took up sport and recreation, and they entertained themselves. And these things would continue to happen through the war years. The degree of normal that lingered throughout the war years, I think, is crucial if we're going to understand the tempo and the feel of wartime life on the home front. But the war also did bring with it new things. Separated people from each other, from their loved ones and families as men and women marched off to war, often for years, sometimes forever. And while families were deeply proud of their loved ones serving, as the vast number of portraits in uniform suggest, they undoubtedly worried constantly for their safety and wondered when their eventual return home might come. Seeing uniformed people in the streets and the shops of their towns, as well as the instruments and the machines of war in their streets, sometimes provided a necessary visual and even visceral sense that despite its remoteness, the war was real. They had aircraft in their skies, trucks and other military vehicles driving down their roads. And that was always a reminder that for all the normal that continued, things were not normal per se. And this was really pronounced in communities like Vernon, which had a large-scale military base, or Chilliwack, where there was also an infantry training base. And of course, in other communities around the province, militia regiments continued to function as entities and agencies in their communities during the war, taking in new recruits, providing them some initial training, offering color guards, bands, and units to public events in their towns. And of course, you had air bases in Abbotsford and Comox, Boundary Bay, Pat Bay, and elsewhere as well. And Esquimalt was a major naval base. What this meant in those communities that had a significant military presence is that in places like Vernon, you could have victory bond parades and Remembrance Day parades that had a substantial martial presence to them. A lot of Bren gun carriers driving down your street was an impressive sight. A truck with a hunk of wood mounted on the front that sort of looked like a gun in Caramu's, slightly less impressive. But people did the best they could, and the local band chief and his wife led the color guard on horseback. So people found ways to bring the war into these public events that they were having as best they could. One important way that the war did change things was in the way the community members came together, kinds of public events, long-standing traditions of gatherings like May Day, Labor Day, that sort of thing. Often now you're seeing uniformed people in these. Remembrance Day and other acts of commemoration now had a different sense of gravity to them. These were events in which Great War veterans continued to hold the primacy. But they also argued that they were the ones best equipped to continue to shape and direct not only Armistice Day, but all acts of commemoration and memorialization of service during the war in communities across the province. And it's only at the end of the war and the early post-war where more veterans returned from the new conflict and their voices begin to be added around the table that the shift will become more permanent between Great War veterans' dominance and Second World War veterans' dominance. Wartime realities and pressures were always evident during the war years and communities' celebrations. These often became now moments, and you see, more uniforms. These became times where people could encourage each other, try and keep up morale. I love this. It was literally called a cheer up concert in Beacon Hill Park. And that would have been needed by 1943, right? The war was still a long way from done and people were weary of war. Maybe the best place to do this was in Kelowna, the regatta. They really had some enthusiasm there. The actual caption on that photo is Nazi-themed carnival games. I'm not sure exactly what that entails, but it made the war real. And then, of course, a clown diver dressed as Hitler about to dive from the tower during the Kelowna regatta in 1944. I find Hitler portrayed with bare thighs oddly unsettling. And family entertainment of choice, burning an effigy of Hitler. As these images make clear, the war was a collective endeavor where members of communities consumed information about the war, where they supported each other, where they became engaged in war-related activities in a collaborative, mutually supporting manner. So when scholars talk about hometown horizons, these are the types of communal activities that they're referencing. Now, of course, the war also made British Columbians fearful of being attacked at various stages of the conflict, at least in certain portions of the province. But most evidently here on the West Coast after Japan entered the war in 1941, the prospect of a raid or potentially of an air raid against the coast was plausible. And so British Columbians had to look to their defenses. The federal government stationed tens of thousands of soldiers, sailors, and aircrew along the BC coast through 1942 and 43, garrisoned in a wide variety of locations, some of them pretty remote, like York Island on the top right there. And even the BC police got a somewhat bellicose makeover, as these oddly enthusiastic PR photos imply. In addition, thousands of British Columbians would join either the Pacific Coast Militia Rangers, a volunteer home defense force, to defend their own communities. Others who were in the fishing marine services could serve with the Fishermen's Reserve, fleet of vessels that helped provide eyes and ears to the Royal Canadian Navy and the Royal Canadian Air Force in patrolling BC's long coastline. Now, of course, from a cozy office at National Defense Headquarters in Ottawa, it was possible to write a military threat assessment that acknowledged the actual risk of a Japanese attack on the BC coast. Ground attack, even an air raid, was highly unlikely in 1942 and next to impossible in 1943. And even then, nothing more than a brief hit and run raid or maybe an airstrike launched from a Japanese carrier if it could sneak close enough to the BC coast. No prolonged invasion was ever envisioned. But of course, when you weren't sitting in a cozy office in Ottawa, and when the prospect of that hit and run raid was rumbling into your downtown in Port Alberni or Prince Rupert, or the prospect of those bombs falling onto your children's school here in Victoria or in Vancouver, well, that changed your perspective on things. People felt vulnerable. And so officials took precautions. Air raid protection committees were established in many BC communities. Regulations were set up to ensure people blacked out their windows at night. Patrols moved around communities regularly to ensure people were abiding by the regulations. Fire protection was enhanced, public drills and training and mock events were held to enhance readiness, to prepare for these events. And the sense of how ad hoc things are, that top left one, a civil defense air raid siren. It was mounted on a trailer towed behind a car in Surrey. Surrey's a big place. It's hard to get enough sirens to get everybody the word out if you need to. People were familiarized with the function and the use of gas masks. And people and companies built bomb shelters, including here in Sydney, BC Telephone Company. And that image on the left, I think, again, like the one on the poster for this, incredibly evocative. As a parent watching your child learn how to properly use a respirator, how do you not imagine the possibility of that being needed in earnest? These sorts of things made the war feel real and imminent. And all this energy, the public activism, the education efforts, which were important and necessary, the ARP drills and training, only seemed to enhance the threat, the possibility of these events happening. So I think for British Columbians, fear was a real and genuine commodity. In British Columbians' private lives, the war wound its way in also in a variety of ways and places. In the home, even on the dinner table, through rationing, anti-hoarding campaigns, victory garden campaigns. Education was carried out in shop front windows and public displays and theaters, amongst others. For children, the war was a vivid time in their lives. Those who were in school and growing up in this time period. Cadet programs proliferated across the country, both for boys and girls, in every corner of the province. And fundraising, often organized through schools, sometimes as community events, salvage activities, hugely important for kids, and a variety of patriotic and humanitarian endeavors. In the workplace, the war would alter the working population because of the huge demand for what was an increasingly short labor supply, meant that unions would make gains during the war. women would find places in the workforce not typically open to them in peacetime. So too did other ethnic minorities and Indigenous peoples, for whom the war was in many ways the best of times. The government dug into people's pockets with high wartime taxation and forced savings plans that by 1943-44 might have taken as much as a third of your pay and set it aside for you for after the war. And corporate efforts to try and foster victory bond sales. Companies were often very active in organizing their workers for communal efforts. And even if you had money, frankly, there wasn't a lot to buy because, of course, civilian manufacture had been largely shut down in the first couple of years of the war. The war would absorb people's voluntary efforts as well. And it's worth remembering that in a time before Netflix, PlayStation, and social media, people in this era met socially and filled their evenings and their weekends by volunteering for or joining in a range of different organizations. Historian Jonathan Vance coined the term aggressive sociability, which I think is a really great turn of phrase and a great way to understand the intensity of this sort of thing, particularly in small communities in BC. A lot of people would have been part of multiple different organizations like the Imperial Order of the Daughters of the Empire, or the Loyal Order of Moose, or Elks, the Red Cross, and a whole range of others, the Women's Institute. And as the war broke out and carried on, a lot of these organizations would turn much of their energies to war-related work. But there would also be a range of new entities that would come up, like the BC Women's Service Corps, the ARP committees, and a range of specific wartime and humanitarian charities, some of them patriotic, that raised money for a whole range of different efforts. And often the urge to help was just more grassroots than that. It might be a group of people at work who would create a committee to do war-related efforts, or people just can stuff. There was this urge to feel like you were contributing, to take part, to do something meaningful. I think sometimes feeling a war that remote could leave you feeling helpless. And so British Columbians took action. And to me, what all of this suggests is, the incredible generosity of British Columbians' time and energy that they poured into war work. Suggests a really widespread, deep, and genuine engagement in the war effort across the spectrum of the population. This was never about just bulletproof 19-year-old boys running off to war and adventure. It's much deeper than that. And of course, one of the biggies was volunteering in patriotic giving during the war were the 9 victory loan campaigns that the federal government launched between 1941 and 1945. These were huge undertakings. Through this, Canadian citizens and corporations funded the bulk of the federal government's war effort. There were campaigns and offices established in BC communities all over the province, with local regions and communities having set quotas to reach for each campaign, and vigorous competition between the various communities over who could reach their quota first, who could overshoot it by the most. These were a big deal. And they were supported with parades and public events to try and foster, encourage, and if need be, shame British Columbians into opening their wallets for the cause. In a lot of ways, I think the fundraising must have been relentless, especially by the latter stages of the war. It was a reality every day at work, in the streets, in the media, in church, in social gatherings. And British Columbians gave hundreds of millions of dollars to various causes. And yet donor fatigue must have been immense. If you just look at the pervasiveness of the victory bond advertising here in Victoria, right? All the different parade floats. I love the one at the top, the Fraternal Order of Eagles. And the individuals that were part of its membership had purchased $60,000 worth of war bonds by this stage in the war. That's one group of Eagles in one community. So if you avoided the parade, because it was pretty intense, you still had to walk by the shops, the power poles. You had to go to the bank, do some banking. It was sort of hard to avoid there too. And the trams and public transport. It was simply pervasive. It was ever present in people's lives. Now, by war's end, this is incredibly valuable for British Columbians, as it was for all Canadians, because most had saved a sizable nest egg between war savings certificates, enforced savings, and buying victory bonds. Most people ended the war with a nice chunk of money to help reestablish themselves in the peace that followed. It's one of the reasons why we have baby boom, growth of suburbia, people's home ownership expanding, car ownership, because people had the resources from that wartime boom to do so. But by 1945, people were weary and ready for peace. They were ready, especially for the return of loved ones, some of whom had been overseas for 4, 5, even 6 years at this point. And when VE Day came finally in May of 1945, British Columbians celebrated together, as they had done everything through the war together. Here in Victoria, you can see the ledge set up in war ceremony bunting and a big V. People parking along Blanchard. It's a lot less developed. But also all around the province. And of course, BJ Day as well, in August of 1945. And over the year that followed and more, they would welcome back their loved ones with joyous tears, warm hugs, and a profound sense of relief as the soldiers came home. Couldn't figure out where to fit this one into the talk, but I really wanted to use it because I've never been a fan of cabbage, and this seems to me the surest sign that war brings out the most desperate of measures in all sorts of ways. Anyway. So I hope you found the stories and images I shared today interesting and informative. I think they tell a story of a time of substantial change and growth in this province, development that began the process, or at least helped set the stage for the construction of modern British Columbia that we live in and know today. They also tell a story, I think, of a period that deeply challenged the residents of this province, that engaged British Columbians in collective endeavor for a common cause in ways that sometimes sharpened lines of division, especially for those deemed outside the we group, for enemy aliens, for conscientious objectors, for example. But it also bound them together to each other. It made British Columbians both, I think, in some ways more British Columbian, but also immensely more Canadian. Being connected to that national war effort was something that made British Columbians feel a sense of nationality to a degree they probably never had before. And I think in all these ways, it left enduring marks upon both the province and its residents. And I hope you'll keep some of these stories in your memories as British Columbians, and that collectively you can help me to reintegrate this part of our history into how, as we residents of this lovely and beautiful place, know ourselves and our communities. Thank you.